June 22nd, 1941. Soviet border, near Grodno. Oberst Heinrich Müller stared in disbelief through his binoculars at the strange tank emerging from the dawn dust. Its sloped shape, its wide tracks, its 76mm cannon pointing directly at his column of Panzer IIIs. "Impossible," he muttered. "The Soviets don't have anything like this." Seconds later, the T-34's shell penetrated the frontal armor of his tank like paper. What Oberst Müller couldn't imagine, what no German commander on that summer day could foresee, was that he was facing the most influential tank of World War II, a machine that would forever change armored combat doctrine, and whose fundamental design would remain relevant decades after its conception. German engineers, examining the first intact captured T-34, sent their assessment to Berlin. "This tank technically surpasses all our current designs. Its sloped armor, mobility, and armament represent a qualitative leap we did not anticipate." They were right about everything. The T-34 would not only outlive its creators, it would outlive the war for which it was designed, serve in more than 40 countries, participate in conflicts on 4 continents, and remain in active service in some armies well into the 21st century. This is the story of how an emergency design born from desperation became the most produced tank in history, of how brutal simplicity triumphed over technical perfection, of how a tank considered primitive by some became the symbol of Soviet victory and changed armored warfare forever. The Crisis of 1939. Birth in Chaos. In 1939, the Soviet Union faced an existential crisis. The Winter War against Finland had exposed the terrible deficiencies of Soviet tanks. The T-26 and BT-7, the Red Army's main tanks, were vulnerable, poorly armed, and mechanically unreliable in the brutal winter climate. Mikhail Koshkin, chief designer at the Kharkiv Locomotive Plant, had been secretly working on a revolutionary design, the A-32, a medium tank that broke with all conventions. In December 1939, the Defense Committee ordered comparative tests. Koshkin knew his design was superior, but he also knew that Kremlin bureaucrats distrusted the radical. What happened next became legend in Soviet engineering history. Koshkin and his team conducted an epic march. 2 T-34 prototypes traveled from Kharkov to Moscow, 750 kilometers in the dead of winter, to demonstrate their reliability. They then continued to Minsk, then to Smolensk, and finally back to Kharkov, completing more than 3,000 kilometers in the worst imaginable conditions. Alexander Morozov, Koshkin's deputy engineer, recalled decades later, "We had no time for conventional testing. If the prototypes could survive that winter hell, they could survive anything." Mikhail bet his life on this tank, literally. The design that emerged from that winter odyssey was radically different from any previous tank. Sloped armor of 45mm at 60 degrees, effectively doubling its resistance Phi-2 diesel engine with 12 cylinders and 500 horsepower, more economical and less flammable than gasoline engine's 76.2mm cannon, superior to any German anti-tank weapon of 1941 wide 500mm tracks that distributed weight and allowed mobility on soft terrain. Modified Christie suspension that provided exceptional speed and maneuverability. On March 31, 1940, the T-34 was officially adopted by the Red Army. Mikhail Koshkin, exhausted from the test march and ill with pneumonia contracted during the journey, would die 6 months later. He never saw his creation in combat. What no one in that approval room understood was that the emergency design, born from desperation, contained an accidental feature that would ensure its longevity: radical simplicity that allowed mass production and maintenance under the most extreme conditions. The Steel Monster, engineering the impossible. When the first T-34 Model 1940 rolled off the production line at Plant 183 in Kharkov, military observers were divided. It was brutally functional, lacking the refinements of German or British tanks. The T-34 weighed 26.5 tons, considerably lighter than contemporary heavy tanks, but its sloped armor offered protection equivalent to 90mm effective thickness. This innovation, taken from American engineer Walter Christie's designs, was taken to its maximum expression by the Soviets. The frontal armor at 60 degrees deflected projectiles that would pierce vertical armor. German 37mm and 50mm shells simply bounced off. Even the feared German 75mm cannon had initial difficulties against the T-34 at normal combat ranges. The V2 diesel engine was a masterpiece of practical engineering. With 38.8 liters of displacement and developing 500 horsepower, it provided a power-to-weight ratio superior to 19 horsepower per ton. More importantly, diesel was less flammable than gasoline, reducing losses from fires. And in a country rich in oil, but short on high-octane gasoline refineries, diesel was strategically intelligent. The wide 500mm tracks distributed weight so that the T-34 exerted less pressure on the ground than an infantry soldier. This allowed it to traverse mud, snow, and swamps, where German panzers with their narrow tracks got stuck. Major Dmitry Loza, decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union, described his first encounter with the T-34. It was rough, noisy, uncomfortable. But when you accelerated and felt those 26 tons move with the agility of a light tank, when you saw German shells bounce off your armor, you understood you had an advantage. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough, and that was all we needed. The four-man crew operated in Spartan conditions. The commander also served as gunner, a task overload that reduced combat effectiveness. Visibility was terrible, hatches small, communication between tanks limited by the scarcity of radios. But the T-34 had something no German tank possessed. It could be produced in massive quantities by semi-skilled workers, maintained by mechanics with basic training, and operated by crews with weeks of instruction instead of months. The baptism of fire, Barbarossa, on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army had approximately 1,200 T-34s in service. It wasn't enough to stop the initial advance, but it was enough to sow terror among the panzers. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, recorded in his diary on June 25th. "We have encountered a new Soviet tank that is vastly superior to our Panzer III and IV. Our 37mm guns are useless against its frontal armor." German tankers developed desperate tactics. Shoot at the tracks to immobilize the T-34, then surround it and shoot at its thinner rear armor. But this required coordination, time, and consumed precious ammunition. In July 1941, near Dubno, Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko ambushed a German column with his platoon of T-34s. In 1 hour of frantic combat, he destroyed 7 German tanks without losing a single T-34. Lavrinenko would end the war as the Soviet Union's most successful tank ace, with 52 confirmed enemy tanks destroyed before dying in combat in 1941. But the T-34's initial technical advantage was partially negated by tactical deficiencies. The lack of radios meant individual tanks operated in isolation. Commanders with dual gunner duties couldn't coordinate effectively. Rushed crew training resulted in costly errors. And above all, the German invasion had captured the main production plants. Plant 183 in Kharkov had to be evacuated in October 1941, dismantled, transported 2,000 kilometers east to the Urals, and rebuilt in Nizhny Tagil under unimaginable conditions. Total production, the industrial miracle of Tankograd. The evacuation and reconstruction of the Soviet tank industry was one of the most extraordinary industrial feats in history. Entire plants were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt beyond the Urals, out of reach of German bombers. Nizhny Tagil, rechristened Tankograd, became the heart of T-34 production. Working in brutal conditions, with temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius in winter, 12-hour shifts, food shortages, skilled workers, women, teenagers, and elderly produced T-34s at a pace that defied all industrial logic. In 1941, before evacuation, the Soviet Union produced 2,996 T-34s. In 1942, amid the chaos of relocation, they still produced 12,520. In 1943, production reached 15,696 tanks. By the end of the war, more than 57,000 T-34s had rolled out of Soviet factories. The design's simplicity was crucial. A T-34 Model 1941 required approximately 8,000 man-hours for construction. Designers continued simplifying, eliminating unnecessary refinements, standardizing components, developing automatic welding techniques. Zenaida Mikhailovna Kondratieva, a welder at Plant 183, recalled, "We worked until collapse. We welded armor non-stop. Every tank that left the factory meant Soviet lives saved at the front. It wasn't work. It was war. We fought with welding torches instead of rifles. Quality inevitably suffered. Tanks left the factory with rough finishes, hastily adjusted mechanical systems, paint applied over metal still warm from welding. But they worked, and they kept working long enough to reach the front, fight, and generally be destroyed in combat before mechanical deficiencies became critical. The average life expectancy of a T-34 at the front was 6 months in 1941 to 1942. But it didn't matter. For every T-34 destroyed, 3 more rolled out of the factories. The evolution from T-34/76 to T-34/85. In 1943, the T-34's advantage began to erode. The Germans had developed the Panzer V Panther and Panzer VI Tiger, both with heavier armor and 75mm and 88mm guns that could destroy a T-34 at ranges of 2,000 meters. The T-34's 76.2mm cannon, devastating in 1941, now struggled against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. An urgent modernization was needed. In December 1943, the T-34/85 entered production. The main change was an 85mm cannon, derived from the anti-aircraft gun of the same caliber, which could penetrate 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The turret was redesigned and enlarged, finally allowing a 5-man crew with a dedicated commander, dramatically improving combat effectiveness. The T-34/85 weighed 32 tons, maintained the same mobility thanks to engine improvements, and finally matched German armament. More importantly, it maintained the ease of production of the original model. Lieutenant Alexander Fadden, a veteran of the T-34/76 who transitioned to the T-34/85, noted the difference. With the /85, we finally had a fair chance against the Panthers. And having a dedicated commander changed everything. I could concentrate on the tactical situation while my gunner focused on firing. It was like fighting with our eyes finally open. Between 1944 and 1945, more than 22,000 T-34/85s were produced. They participated in all the major final offensives: Operation Barbarossa, the liberation of Poland, the Battle of Berlin. The global legacy: 3 continents, 5 decades. The end of World War II didn't mean the retirement of the T-34. On the contrary, it began its second life as the most exported tank in history. The Soviet Union exported or gifted thousands of T-34/85s to Cold War allies: China, North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, African countries, liberation movements in Latin America. In the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, North Korean T-34/85s initially dominated the battlefield. On June 25, 1950, 150 T-34s led the invasion of the South, steamrolling initial resistance. Only the intervention of American M-26 Pershing and M-46 Patton tanks, along with massive airstrikes, stopped their advance. In the Six-Day War, 1967, Egypt and Syria deployed hundreds of T-34/85s against Israel. Although already obsolete against Israeli Centurions and M48 Pattons, the T-34s still fought fiercely. Many were destroyed, but some Egyptian crews fought with determination that surprised their opponents. In Vietnam, North Vietnamese Army T-34/85s participated in the final 1975 offensive that captured Saigon. Iconic images show T-34s crashing through the gates of the presidential palace, culminating a 3-decade war. Even in the 1990s, during the Yugoslav wars, T-34/85s stored since World War II were reactivated and used by Serbian and Croatian militias. 50-year-old tanks firing in urban combat in Europe. The paradox, primitive and unsurpassed. In 2000, when the last T-34/85 was finally retired from active service in some small armies, it had served in military operations for 59 continuous years, a record for any armored combat vehicle. Its limitations were always obvious: brutal discomfort for the crew, poor visibility, primitive communication systems, rough finish. Any rational military analyst would have said it should have been retired in the 1950s. Yet it continued serving because it offered a unique combination: good enough in combat, extraordinarily reliable mechanically, cheap to produce and maintain, simple to operate. The T-34 demonstrated a fundamental principle: in war, perfection is the enemy of good enough. A perfect tank that can only be produced in small quantities loses against an adequate tank that can be produced by the thousands. Conclusion: the immortal tank. Between 1940 and 1958, more than 84,000 T-34s were produced in the Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. It is the second most produced tank in history, only surpassed by the Soviet T-54/55. Which owes much of its design to the T-34. The T-34 wasn't the best tank of World War II in pure technical terms. The German Panzer had better armor and armament. The American Sherman had better ergonomics and reliability. The British Churchill had better protection. But the T-34 was the most important tank of the war. It changed the paradigm of tank design. Sloped armor became universal standard. Diesel engines replaced gasoline ones. Mobility was valued as much as protection. And it demonstrated that quantity has a quality of its own. The 57,000 T-34s produced during the war flooded the Eastern Front, allowing the Soviet Union to absorb losses that would have destroyed any other army and continue attacking. Today, restored T-34s participate in parades in Moscow. Museums around the world exhibit them. Some still function in military training as mobile targets. The legacy of the T-34 is immortal. It demonstrated that brilliant engineering doesn't require complexity, that combat effectiveness matters more than technical perfection, and that a truly revolutionary design can change the course of history. In some museum in 2040, a T-34 will celebrate its centennial. And visitors, looking at its angular and unmistakable silhouette, will remember that this brutal, simple, and revolutionary tank helped change the world.